Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Usually when we think about national defense, we tend to picture something highly visible, right?
Yeah, geographically defined, like a map.
Exactly. It's like looking at a rigid architectural blueprint. You look at the map, you see a national border, you station a military unit right there at that border, and a general essentially points to the line and says, that right there is the front line.
Right, and it provides this profound sense of certainty. I mean, traditional defense relies heavily on threats being easily identifiable.
They wear uniforms, right?
They were uniforms, yeah.
Yeah.
They march under a specific flag, and they operate within a clearly categorized theater of war. It's a very binary system. You are an enemy or you are an ally. You are inbounds or you are out of bounds.
But the moment you step into the world of domestic counterintelligence, that entire blueprint just becomes completely useless.
Well, absolutely useless.
The defensive landscape we are looking at is entirely murky. I mean, the front line is no longer a trench or a beach.
No, not at all.
The front line might be, a university chemistry laboratory or a quiet trade union meeting in a pub somewhere, or maybe a humming digital server room in some corporate basement.
Yeah, operating in the shadows is pretty much the absolute definition of domestic security. The adversaries do not wear uniforms, and the weapons are rarely conventional firearms.
Right. The weapons are stolen blueprints or compromised officials or even fabricated information.
Exactly. And that is exactly what we are going to explore today in this deep dive. We are undertaking a comprehensive chronological examination of the history of MI5, which is the United Kingdom's domestic counterintelligence and security agency.
And for you, the listener, the objective here is to really trace a rather incredible evolution. We are going to look at how a tiny, severely underfunded bureau, which was created originally for the sole purpose of tracking German spies, how it morphed over a century into this massive, multi-billion-pound modern intelligence apparatus.
It's a critical history to understand, too, because the evolution of MI5, well, it maps perfectly onto the evolution of modern conflict itself.
It really does. It's a journey that moves from the threat of physical sabotage at naval shipyards all the way to ideological subversion during the Cold War.
And eventually, to the highly complex, state-sponsored hybrid cyber threats of the present day.
Yeah. And we are also going to examine the constant friction that exists at the very core of this agency. That perpetual balancing act between maintaining national security and preserving civil liberties in a democratic society.
Right, because if you want to grasp how modern global security actually functions behind closed doors, understanding the internal mechanics and the structural evolution of MI5 is absolutely essential.
And we also have to look at their historical failures, right? Because they definitely had them.
Oh, without a doubt. But to understand any of that, we have to start at the beginning. The foundational DNA of the agency was forged in a very specific climate of anxiety.
So we are talking about the early 20th century here.
Yeah, specifically the years leading up to the First World War.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the environment in Britain around 1909 was intensely paranoid.
That is a good word for it. Paranoid.
You have the Anglo-German naval arms race escalating. Imperial Germany is rapidly building these massive dreadnought battleships, basically attempting to challenge the supremacy of the British Royal Navy.
And alongside that very visible military buildup, there is this growing, almost feverish public concern. It was heavily fueled by the press and even by speculative fiction at the time, suggesting that Britain is just swarming with German spies.
Swarming with them. The Admiralty and the War Office were receiving constant reports of this extensive espionage network, right? And supposedly it was linked directly to German naval intelligence.
Right. The fear was that Imperial Germany was actively mapping out British ports, assessing fleet readiness, and basically preparing for preemptive sabotage.
So in response to this high-level anxiety, the British government steps in, and they established the Secret Service Bureau on the 7th of October, 1909.
And initially, they set up a very clear division of labor. The Bureau is split into two distinct branches.
Right, so you have Captain Vernon Kell. He is chosen to lead the home section. And this is the branch that eventually becomes MI5.
Yes, and its mandate is strictly focused on domestic counterespionage.
And then on the other side, you have Commander Mansfield Cumming, who takes charge of the foreign section, which handles overseas intelligence gathering. And that branch eventually evolves into MI6.
The division was highly practical. I mean, Cummings' mandate was to look outward, to gather intelligence on the Imperial German Navy fleet and their strategic intentions abroad.
Well, Kell's focus was strictly inward.
Exactly. His job was to figure out exactly what German agents were already doing within the borders of the British Empire.
Okay, so think about it like a fledgling startup trying to find its market fit. They realize pretty quickly they're dealing with completely different operational environments, so they essentially split into two distinct companies, one domestic, one foreign.
That is actually a great analogy, and is crucial to understand that Kell started this monumental task with essentially zero infrastructure.
The numbers regarding their early staffing are genuinely staggering when you consider the mandate. I mean, Kell started the home section with just two officers, himself and one other person.
Yeah.
And by August 1914, right on the precipice of a global conflict, that number had grown to a mere 16 personnel. And that number includes the clerical support staff.
With a skeleton crew of that size, they could not rely on field surveillance in the traditional sense. You just cannot follow hundreds of suspects with a dozen people.
So what did they do?
Well, their early operations had to be entirely driven by meticulous administration and documentation. They focused their limited resources on tracking German nationals and immigrants, specifically at key naval and shipping ports.
But how exactly did they manage that without any modern technology? Because we are talking about an era long before digital databases or facial recognition or any of that.
They built a massive physical card index system.
Literally just index cards.
Just index cards. It was an exhaustive administrative effort. They combed through public records, hotel registries, and basic observations of the German expatriate community.
That sounds incredibly tedious.
Oh, very much so. But they meticulously cross-referenced names, addresses, and known associates. And crucially, they also relied heavily on intercepted correspondence.
Right, opening the mail.
Exactly. Using home office warrants, they worked directly with the Postal Service to intercept and read the mail of suspected individuals looking for invisible ink or coded messages communicating with the continent.
Okay, this meticulous administrative approach might sound a bit dry, but the payoff was absolute. I mean, fast forward to the 4th of August, 1914.
Very day the First World War breaks out.
Right. Kell's tiny section of 16 people executes a massive, coordinated roundup. In a single sweep, relying entirely on the connections they had mapped out in that physical card index, they successfully interned 22 identified German agents.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the strategic value of scooping up those 22 agents on day one of the war is difficult to overstate. By neutralizing that specific network immediately, MI5 effectively blinded German military intelligence on British soil.
It prevented any immediate intelligence leaks regarding British military movements. Specifically, it protected the dispatch of the British Expeditionary Force across the English Channel to the continent.
Yeah, the Germans had absolutely no idea the troop movements were happening until the British soldiers were actually already on the ground.
That is just wild.
It established a foundational doctrine for MI5 that persists to this day, actually. This early success proved the value of proactive identification and containment as opposed to reactive policing.
Right, because traditional law enforcement waits for a crime to occur, right? They wait for the factory to blow up and then they investigate.
Exactly. Kell's approach was entirely different. By using the card index to map the network meticulously in peacetime, they were identifying the saboteurs before the fuse was even lit.
And throughout the First World War, the wartime successes of the agency were formidable. MI5 apprehended 65 of at least 120 spies dispatched by Germany.
And the consequences for those captured were severe.
Yeah, they faced trial under the Defense of the Realm Act. Several were actually executed by firing squad at the Tower of London.
Which served as a brutal but highly effective deterrent. By 1918, the agency assessed that no significant enemy spies were operating freely in the country at all.
The rigorous port controls and the alien registration protocols had completely neutralized German reconnaissance attempts, right? Even those using neutral shipping vessels.
Yeah. And they handled this massive expansion of wartime duties. Kell's staff had ballooned. They went from those original 16 people in 1914 to 844 personnel by the time the armistice was signed.
But that massive wartime expansion was completely unsustainable. The end of the war in 1918 brought a sudden peace. And with that peace came a pretty devastating bureaucratic reality.
The transition from wartime to peacetime is historically the most dangerous period for intelligence agencies.
Right, because politicians who were highly conscious of national budgets after a financially ruinous global war, they look at Kell's massive department of over 800 people and basically deem it an unnecessary luxury in peacetime.
The threat landscape is shifting rapidly, but the funding is just disappearing. In 1919, the budget cut to MI5 was catastrophic. Their funding was slashed from £100,000 to a mere £35,000.
And the personnel cuts were even more severe, weren't they?
Or absolutely. They went from over 800 staff members to just 12 officers.
Oh,
12 officers. It is a complete bureaucratic decimation, and it happens just as a highly dangerous, entirely new threat is emerging.
right. And alongside the financial starvation, there was also this fierce internal power struggle going on. You have Sir Basil Thompson, the head of Special Branch, and he was appointed Director of Home Intelligence.
Yeah, Thompson essentially executed a power grab. He took supreme command of all domestic counterinsurgency and counterintelligence investigations.
Several of Kell's own seasoned officers actually defected to Thompson's new, better-funded agency.
Because of this extreme resource drought and the loss of their clear mandate, MI5 was essentially sidelined during major post-war conflicts.
Like the Irish War of Independence, right, between 1919 and 1921.
Exactly. MI5 had no clearly defined role there. They undertook no tangible intelligence operations of consequence during that entire conflict, other than providing some basic training to British Army case officers.
But while they were sidelined operationally in Ireland, the global landscape was fracturing, which forced the agency to pivot its core focus. The primary threat to the British state was no longer German naval spies counting dreadnoughts at the port.
No. The 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia had fundamentally altered the world order. MI5 turned its attention away from traditional espionage and heavily toward the threat of ideological subversion.
Right. They were looking at attempts by the newly formed Soviet Union, specifically through the Comintern, to surreptitiously support revolutionary activities and basically foment unrest within Britain itself.
This meant focusing heavily on subversion within military units and looking at severe labor unrest. A prime example is the 1920 coal strike, where intelligence officers started linking domestic labor agitators directly to covert Soviet funding.
Because the Comintern, or Communist International, they operated with explicit public directives to export the communist revolution abroad.
Yeah, they were actively attempting to recruit among British students, intellectuals, and industrial workers.
So MI5, despite its severely constrained resources, they realized they have to establish dedicated sections solely for tracking Russian espionage and communist infiltration.
And one of the most significant incidents highlighting this new focus occurred in October 1924. This was the publication of what became known as the Zinoviev Letter.
Right. This was a highly controversial document. It was purportedly a directive from the Comintern chairman, Grigory Zinoviev, addressed to the Communist Party of Great Britain.
And the letter explicitly urged British communists to intensify seditious propaganda within the armed forces and basically prepare for armed rebellion.
When MI5 analysts reviewed the letter, they assessed that its content aligned perfectly with the observed tactics and known objectives of the British Communist Party.
This intelligence assessment was shared with senior political figures. And then, the letter was subsequently leaked to the press just days before a general election.
Which is huge timing.
Huge! The publication of the letter heavily influenced the public mood, aiding a massive conservative electoral victory by completely eroding support for the Labour Party. The press heavily tied Labour to the communist threat.
Now, decades later, historical inquiries conclusively deemed the Zinoviev letter a forgery. It was likely concocted by white Russian exiles aiming to destabilize Anglo-Soviet relations. But MI5's initial assessment that the tactics described in the letter were a genuine reflection of Soviet strategy that was not entirely misplaced, was it?
No, and that is a crucial distinction. Declassified assessments confirm that genuine Soviet penetration efforts, including active, well-funded agent networks, were actively operating in Britain at that exact time.
So the paper was fake, but the threat was real.
Exactly. While the specific piece of paper was a fabrication, the overarching threat of ideological subversion that MI5 was attempting to monitor was a verified historical reality.
Let me push back on this a bit, though, because there seems to be a massive difference between tracking traditional espionage and tracking subversion.
How so?
Well, if a foreign agent sneaks into a naval yard and steals a blueprint for a submarine, that is a physical, measurable act of espionage. But subversion is ideological, is about ideas, speeches, and political organization. So how does a domestic intelligence agency, which by the mid-1920s had dwindled to roughly 35 personnel, actively monitor ideological subversion without completely overstepping the line into acting as a political police force?
You have hit on the core tension of the interwar era right there. It's an incredibly blurred line. The severe lack of funding directly caused their operational methods to shift.
Because they just didn't have the manpower.
Right. Because they had only a few dozen officers, they could not afford to monitor everyone. They could not cast a wide surveillance net over the entire labor movement. Therefore, out of sheer financial necessity, they had to rely on deep ideological infiltration.
Okay, so instead of watching the building from the outside, they had to put someone inside the room.
Precisely. They employed deep cover agents, such as a woman named Olga Gray, who spent years successfully infiltrating the core operations of the Communist Party of Great Britain.
They targeted the ideological leadership.
Yes, because human infiltration was cheaper than broad surveillance. But as you pointed out, this inherently blurred the line between protecting national security and monitoring nonviolent political radicals.
And it is important to note that this monitoring was not exclusively focused on the left wing.
No, not at all.
As we move into the 1930s, against the backdrop of rising fascist activity across Europe, MI5 extended its operations to monitor the extreme right as well.
They focused heavily on the British Union of Fascists. An MI5 officer named Maxwell Knight deployed a network of infiltrators to track Oswald Mosley's fascist groups, specifically looking for any potential covert alliances with Nazi Germany or signs of organized domestic violence.
Yet, despite monitoring these massive political movements on both extremes of the spectrum, the agency remained fundamentally starved of resources. By 1938, with another global war looming on the horizon, MI5 still only had 26 operational officers.
26. The financial numbers are just as stark. From 1939 to 1940, their total operating budget was just £93,000.
Which is nothing.
To put that in perspective, if we account for inflation, that is roughly £5 million in today's money.
That is just terrifying. 26 people responsible for the domestic security of an empire on the brink of war with essentially a £5 million budget.
Compare that figure to the agency's current annual budget of roughly £3.7 billion.
Yeah, that really puts it in perspective. They were attempting to run a national security apparatus against the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany on a shoestring budget.
And this tiny, underfunded, domestically focused agency was suddenly thrust back into the crucible of a global conflict in 1939. The outbreak of the Second World War required a sudden, drastic change in both leadership and operational tactics.
The shift began at the very top. When Winston Churchill took power as prime minister in early 1940, one of his very first administrative actions was to sack the agency's long-term head, Vernon Kell.
The man who had founded the agency in 1909.
Exactly. The guy who had run it for over 30 years was just unceremoniously removed.
Kell was replaced temporarily by his deputy, Oswald Allen Harker, who was widely considered ineffective in the role.
Yeah, he didn't last long.
No. Shortly after, a seasoned man from the Secret Intelligence Service, David Petrie, was brought in and installed as the new Director General, with Harker remaining as his deputy.
And this massive leadership shakeup fundamentally reorganized the agency and set the stage for what would become their defining achievement of the Second World War.
Which was the absolute mastery of the art of deception.
The environment finally allowed for it. Following the end of the Battle of Britain and the subsequent abandonment of German invasion plans which were accurately assessed and reported by British intelligence, thanks in part to the Bletchley Park Ultra Project, breaking the Enigma codes, the initial public hysteria regarding enemy spies began to ease.
The government gradually reversed its sweeping policy of interning enemy aliens, and this breathing room allowed MI5 to transition from basic defensive policing into running highly sophisticated proactive psychological operations against the enemy.
I want to look closely at one specific operation that perfectly illustrates this transition. It involves an MI5 officer named Eric Roberts. His operation, which was codenamed Fifth Column, ran from 1942 all the way to 1945.
Roberts was an English bank clerk turned intelligence officer, and he masqueraded under the alias Jack King. His persona was that he was the Gestapo's top covert man operating in London.
The setup was extraordinarily brazen. I mean, Roberts operated out of a physical, simulated Gestapo office right in the middle of London.
Right in the middle of the city. The space was fully equipped with hidden microphones and recording devices. Acting as Jack King, he would arrange meetings with British citizens who were actively expressing pro-Nazi sentiments.
He encouraged them to share their plans, their grievances, and any sensitive information they had acquired. And the scale of it is wild. Roberts managed to string along roughly 500 British fascist sympathizers.
500 people. These were people who genuinely wanted the Nazis to win.
Yeah, when these recruits brought him intelligence, Perhaps they worked in a munitions factory or had observed troop movements, he praised them and promised to pass the information directly on to his superiors in Berlin.
But in reality, every single piece of intelligence went straight into MI5's filing cabinets.
The brilliance of the operation was in its containment, really.
Exactly. By keeping these 500 highly motivated individuals busy talking to him, seeking his approval, and bringing him information, he effectively neutralized them.
He prevented them from attempting actual physical acts of sabotage because they believed they were already serving the Reich by reporting to him.
But this raises a massive ethical question, and it was deeply controversial even within MI5 at the time. You've seen your figures like Guy Liddell arguing that Roberts' operation bordered dangerously on entrapment.
Well, yeah, he was essentially simulating enemy inducement. He was actively encouraging British citizens to commit treason.
The legal and ethical line was incredibly thin. The primary defense of the Roberts operation, from an operational standpoint, was that he never prompted or instructed his targets to commit actual criminal acts of violence or sabotage.
He just listened to them.
He merely provided a safe, contained receptacle for their existing treasonous intent. The agency calculated that the net security gains identifying a vast, dormant network of sympathizers without any actual espionage output ever reaching Germany far outweighed the ethical risks of acting as an agent provocateur.
And MI5 ultimately decided not to prosecute any of these individuals after the war. Instead, they just buried the entire operation. They covered it up completely.
They even went so far as to manufacture fake Nazi medals and distribute them to some of Roberts' most dedicated recruits just to keep them placated and engaged until the war ended.
Wait, seriously? Fake medals?
Yes. The recruits lived the rest of their lives never knowing they had been working for British intelligence.
That is just incredible. It was an exercise in total psychological control. And that concept of controlling the narrative leads us directly to the crowning intelligence achievement of MI5 during the conflict, which is the double-cross system.
Right. This operation was overseen by a highly secretive subcommittee known as the 20 Committee. They got the name through a bit of intelligence community wordplay, because the Roman numerals for 20 form a double cross.
The foundation of the system was laid in a 1936 internal MI5 memo. That memo criticized the agency's old First World War policy, which was simply to arrest, interrogate, and execute every enemy agent they found.
The memo argued this was a waste of a vital resource. The proposed new policy was that whenever an enemy agent was captured, the primary objective should be to attempt to turn them.
And the mechanics of it were ruthless. When MI5 captured a German spy landing on British shores, they would offer them a stark binary choice.
They could face immediate prosecution under the Treason Act, which meant a nearly guaranteed death penalty by hanging. Or they could agree to work for British intelligence as a double agent.
The system was devastatingly effective. They captured and successfully turned nearly every single German agent dispatched to the British Isles.
By 1941, MI5 confidently assessed that there were 0 genuine, uncontrolled German spies operating freely in the UK.
0.
Every single piece of human intelligence flowing back to Berlin from Britain was actually being authored or approved by MI5.
The most famous figure in the system, and arguably one of the greatest spies in history, was a man named Juan Pujol Garcia, who was given the codename Garbo.
He was a Spanish citizen who despised both fascism and communism.
He initially offered his services to the British, was rejected, and so he decided to create a fake intelligence network on his own just to prove his worth.
Garbo was an absolute master of fabrication. Operating initially out of Lisbon, armed with nothing but a tourist guide to England, a map, and some outdated train schedules, he began feeding the German military intelligence, the Abwehr, reports about life and military movements in Britain.
And he had never even been to the UK.
Never set foot there. But his reports were so convincing that the British intercepted the German transmissions, realized someone was successfully deceiving the Abwehr, and finally brought him into the fold.
Once Garbo was working with MI5, they scaled his operation up immensely. He didn't just pretend to be one spy, he entirely fabricated a network of 27 distinct sub-agents.
To understand the mechanics of this, you have to appreciate the sheer administrative burden of the lie. Garbo and his MI5 handlers had to maintain 27 different personalities.
It's like writing a massive novel.
Exactly. They created fake expense reports for these non-existent agents. They wrote letters in invisible ink mimicking different handwriting styles. They had to ensure that the intelligence these fake agents provided was logically consistent with their fabricated locations and occupations.
They would mix real but strategically delayed or harmless information with absolute fictions to build the Abwehr's trust.
And all of that trust building was for one specific purpose. The intelligence Garbo fed to the German High Command was the absolute linchpin for Operation Fortitude.
Right. This was the massive Allied deception plan designed to mislead the Germans about the true location of the 1944 D-Day landings.
Garbo, utilizing his fictional network, bombarded the Abwehr with hundreds of messages indicating that the military buildup opposite Normandy was merely a massive, elaborate feint.
He assured his German handlers that the actual primary invasion force was going to strike further north at Pas-de-Calais.
The deception was so flawlessly executed that even after the Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the German High Command believed Garbo.
They held back vital panzer divisions in Pas-de-Calais for weeks, waiting for an invasion that was never going to come.
That deception undoubtedly saved thousands of Allied lives on the beaches and heavily contributed to the success of the entire European campaign.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because the double-cross system was also used in ways that involved agonizing moral calculations. It was not all bloodless deception.
No, we have to look at the deception campaign surrounding the German V weapons to understand the true psychological burden carried by these intelligence officers.
This is one of the most intense ethical dilemmas of the 20th century. In 1944, the Germans began launching V-1 flying bombs, the Doodlebugs, at London.
These were early cruise missiles, causing massive civilian casualties in the heart of the capital.
The Germans could not see where the rockets were landing, so they relied on their spy network, which, of course, was entirely controlled by MI5, to report the impact locations so they could adjust their targeting coordinates.
What's fascinating here is how MI5, working with scientific advisors, realized they had an opportunity. They used their double agents to report false impact data back to Germany.
They reported that the rockets were overshooting their targets and landing north and west of London.
And the mechanical result of that lie was immediate. Believing their rockets were flying too far, the German commanders recalibrated. They shortened the range of the V-1s.
This caused the rockets to fall short of the densely populated center of London, and instead, they began raining down on the less populated suburbs and the south coast port towns.
This was a deliberate, calculated action. British scientific advisor Frederick Lindemann and intelligence officer R.V. Jones fully recognized the gravity of what they were doing.
By altering those coordinates, they were actively choosing to sacrifice the lives of civilians in the suburbs and port towns in order to save a larger number of civilians in central London. They were redirecting the bombs.
When the War Cabinet finally learned the full extent of this deception on the 15th of August, it caused an uproar. The Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, was appalled.
He explicitly ruled against the operation, arguing that the government had absolutely no moral right to play God, to actively decide which citizens should live and which should die. He demanded the deception stop.
But the reality of war overrode the political directive. R.V. Jones, operating deep within the intelligence apparatus, simply refused to call off the deception without explicit written orders.
And those written orders, trapped in bureaucratic paralysis, never materialized.
Right, and so the deception continued. It is a profound example of how MI5 transitioned from simply capturing spies to actively weaponizing them, taking on godlike authority over life and death in the process.
The psychological mastery required to run the double-cross system without the Germans ever realizing they were being fed coordinated lies is unprecedented. It required total, unyielding control over the information environment.
But while MI5 had successfully mastered deception operations against the Germans, that severe interwar underfunding we discussed earlier, combined with their heavy focus on tracking fascism, had left a massive institutional blind spot.
And that blind spot allowed a far more insidious, patient threat to take root deep within their own walls and within the wider British government. Which brings us to the Cold War, the era of the enemy within, spanning from 1945 all the way to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991.
The defining failure of this entire era for MI5 was their agonizing inability to conclusively detect and dismantle the Cambridge 5 spy ring.
To understand how this happened, we have to look at the recruitment mechanics. It goes back to a brilliant Soviet recruiter named Arnold Deutsch, operating in Britain during the 1930s.
Deutsch's strategy was explicit and radically different from traditional espionage recruitment. He told his superiors in Moscow, "We do not need working-class agitators. We need people who could penetrate directly into the bourgeois institutions of the British state.
Deutsch specifically discouraged his targets from joining the Communist Party of Great Britain or attending public protests. He wanted them completely clean on paper.
He knew that if they had no public association with radical politics, they would be immune from any superficial background checks in the future.
So he targeted brilliant undergraduates at Cambridge University in the 1930s, specifically those involved in intellectual societies like the Apostles.
He preyed on their intense anti-fascist sentiments, convincing them that only the Soviet Union could truly stand against the rise of Nazi Germany. The key figures he recruited were Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross.
These were men from the highest echelons of the British elite. They went on to infiltrate nearly every critical office of the British government. They held senior positions in MI5, MI6, and the Foreign Office.
The scale of the intelligence leak they provided is almost incomprehensible. During the Second World War, the Five provided so much highly classified material, including decrypted ultra-intercepts from Bletchley Park and vital atomic research secrets, that handlers in Moscow actually complained to them.
Complain?
Yeah, the volume of stolen documents was so profuse that the Soviets literally did not have enough clerks to encipher and process it all.
That is just wild. The eventual fallout from this infiltration was devastating to British intelligence and to Anglo-American relations.
The first domino fell in 1951 when Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, sensing the net closing in, suddenly defected to the Soviet Union.
And their escape was facilitated by advance warnings from Kim Philby, who was himself deeply embedded in British intelligence.
Later, in 1964, Anthony Blunt, who had previously served as an MI5 officer and was at the time serving as the surveyor of the Queen's pictures, privately confessed in exchange for immunity from prosecution.
Remarkably, his confession was kept entirely secret from the British public until it was exposed in Parliament in 1979.
Right.
I have to stop and ask a fundamental question here about the mechanics of this failure. How did the Cambridge Five manage to infiltrate the very heart of the intelligence apparatus without raising alarms for years?
That's a great question.
Because if we think about this in the context of a modern corporate security breach, it is as if the IT administrators themselves are the hackers. They are completely bypassing all the external firewalls because they already hold the physical keys to the server room. How did MI5 let them get the keys?
That analogy is incredibly precise. The external firewall they bypassed was the British class system itself.
Class system.
Yes. Prior to the severe shocks of the 1950s, MI5 suffered from a catastrophic lack of rigorous vetting procedures. There was an institutional cultural assumption that gentlemen of a certain educational and social pedigree, men who went to Eton and Cambridge, who belonged to the right clubs, were inherently, unquestionably loyal to the crown.
So there was no deep background check, no digging into their personal lives.
Almost none. The vetting was entirely superficial. The Soviets understood this cultural blind spot perfectly. They exploited it during the interwar depression, recruiting ideologically motivated elites who easily breezed past the informal old boy network checks of the time.
It was not until after the Burgess and MacLean defections that MI5 instituted what became known as positive vetting.
Right.
And what exactly does positive vetting entail, mechanically speaking, compared to the old system?
Positive vetting completely removed the assumption of loyalty based on class. It required exhaustive, invasive background investigations. Investigators would audit a candidate's financial records to look for unexplained wealth or crippling debt.
They would conduct extensive interviews with family, former employers, and ex-partners.
They were looking for any hidden vulnerabilities, secret addictions, hidden sexual orientations that were illegal at the time, or undisclosed political affiliations, anything that a hostile state could use for blackmail or leverage.
The implementation of these strict internal vetting protocols marked a significant maturation for MI5. And they did secure some landmark counterintelligence triumphs during the Cold War, demonstrating that they had adapted to the complex Soviet threat.
A prime example of this operational maturation was the dismantling of the Portland spy ring in 1961.
This was a classic deep-cover espionage operation. MI5 surveillance eventually led to the arrest of three key figures: Harry Houghton, Ethel G., and a KGB illegal operative named Conan Malady, who was operating in London under the stolen identity of a Canadian businessman named Gordon Lonsdale.
The mechanics of the Portland ring were straight out of a spy novel. Houghton and G were civil servants working at the highly secretive Admiralty underwater weapons establishment in Portland.
They were stealing classified naval documents, specifically relating to the propulsion and sonar systems of the new nuclear submarine fleet. They would pass these documents to Maladi during brief weekend meetings in London.
Maladi would then use advanced microphotography. He would reduce hundreds of pages of stolen blueprints down to a tiny microdot, hide that microdot inside the spine of a book or a hollowed-out coin, and use a network of dead drops hidden locations in the countryside to transfer the intelligence to his Soviet handlers without ever making face-to-face contact.
MI5 was able to thwart the ring and arrest them red-handed, primarily due to a crucial tip-off from a high-level Soviet defector named Michael Goleniewski.
By breaking the ring, MI5 prevented the transfer of critical naval secrets that would have substantially accelerated Soviet underwater warfare and sonar capabilities.
As the Cold War progressed into the 1970s, MI5's emphasis evolved. They moved beyond just hunting individual spies and focused on broader counter-subversion against the massive Soviet diplomatic presence in London.
This more aggressive posture culminated in Operation Foot in 1971. In a massive coordinated sweep, the British government ordered the expulsion of 105 Soviet intelligence officers from the UK, decimating the KGB's operational infrastructure in London overnight.
But just as MI5 had finally built an architecture capable of containing state-sponsored Cold War espionage, the geopolitical map fractured once again.
The sudden dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 removed their primary adversary, forcing the agency to pivot entirely toward the rising threat of domestic terrorism.
Throughout the 1990s, the dominant domestic security threat demanding MI5's attention was the Provisional Irish Republican Army.
The agency directed substantial resources toward countering the IRA's bombing campaigns on the mainland. This required a massive shift in tactics, necessitating deeply embedded human intelligence networks and aggressive surveillance operations across Northern Ireland.
The signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 significantly reduced the paramilitary campaigns, though MI5 remained vigilant against dissident splinter factions.
But parallel to the later years of the peace process in Northern Ireland, MI5 analysts were identifying a new, evolving threat: the rise of global Islamist extremism.
This threat escalated dramatically after the attacks of September 11, 2001, fundamentally altering MI5's operational reality.
And this shift leads directly to one of the most tragic and scrutinized events in modern British security history: the July 7, 2005 London bombings.
The attacks were executed by 4 British-born extremists. They used homemade peroxide-based explosives, detonating them on 3 London Underground trains and 1 double-decker bus during the morning rush hour.
The coordinated blasts killed 52 civilians and injured over 700 others. It was an unprecedented trauma for the city.
In the aftermath, there was intense public demand to know how this happened. A rigorous oversight review was conducted by the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament.
And the review uncovered a devastating reality. MI5 actually had peripheral fragmentary intelligence on 2 of the bombers from prior, unrelated investigations. The names had crossed their desks.
So if they had their names, why weren't they stopped? How did the plot succeed?
The review dug into the mechanics of the intelligence failure, and it came down to a stark mathematical reality regarding resource allocation. At the time of the bombings, MI5 was attempting to manage and investigate roughly 3,000 active leads regarding potential terrorist activity.
3,000 active leads. We have to unpack what that actually means operationally, because people often think if an agency has a name, they just click a button and track that person. But physical surveillance is incredibly resource intensive, right?
Exactly. To maintain covert, 24-hour physical surveillance on just one single suspect requires a dedicated team of up to 30 officers, rotating shifts, managing vehicles, and monitoring communications.
So you cannot simply pursue 3,000 leads simultaneously with equal intensity. No, the agency has to triage. The review determined there was no professional negligence by MI5 officers. Rather, the tragedy starkly exposed the absolute finite capacity of a preemptive intelligence model. They lack the resources to connect the disparate dots among thousands of background noise reports.
The agency was forced to adapt rapidly to this catastrophic failure. And just a year later, on the 10th of August, 2006, we see the results of that adaptation. MI5 surveillance operations led to the disruption of the massive transatlantic aircraft plot.
This was a staggering operational success. Working in tandem with police, they identified and arrested a highly organized cell of 24 individuals.
This cell was in the final stages of planning to smuggle liquid explosives hidden in soft drink bottles onto up to 10 different passenger flights departing from Heathrow Airport bound for North America.
They planned to detonate them simultaneously mid-flight. Intelligence indicators suggested the action was imminent.
The coordinated arrests undoubtedly prevented a mass casualty event that could have rivaled the scale of the 9/11 attacks. To handle this rapidly evolving, decentralized threat environment, MI5 underwent a massive structural expansion. They realized they could not fight terrorism exclusively from their headquarters in London.
So they decentralized their operations, establishing regional offices across the United Kingdom to enable deeper, localized intelligence gathering and community engagement.
They also became a central pillar in the creation of the Joint Terrorism Analysis Center, or JTAC, established in 2003.
JTAC acts as a multi-agency fusion center, bringing together experts from MI5, MI6, police, and other departments to analyze intelligence and assess threat levels holistically.
Furthermore, they contributed significantly to the government's overarching contest counterterrorism strategy, specifically focusing on the prevent strand, which is aimed at identifying and addressing the ideological drivers of radicalization before individuals turn to violence.
So, what does this all mean? When we look at this evolution from the tragic failure of the 2005 bombings and the backlog of 3,000 leads to the successful disruption of the liquid bomb plot, we have to consider the mechanisms of change. How does an agency actually shift its entire culture to successfully sift through thousands of leads without possessing a crystal ball?
The paradigm shift was profound. For 40 years, MI5 was structured to track a clearly defined state enemy. They were tracking KGB officers who operated out of known embassies with identifiable ranks and diplomatic immunity.
Suddenly, they had to pivot to tracking decentralized, non-state actors. These were individuals who could self-radicalize in their own bedrooms using the internet with no formal ties to a hostile state.
The intelligence failure of 2005 led directly to a massive reallocation of national resources. MI5 received significant budget increases. They moved aggressively toward expansive agent running and early disruption tactics.
They relied heavily on fusion centers like JTAC to prioritize threats based on strict assessments of imminent operational risk, rather than simply monitoring individuals based on historical associations or ideological rhetoric.
However, this massive expansion in domestic surveillance powers, the proliferation of digital interception, and the heavy reliance on complex informant networks to fight terrorism inevitably led to severe legal and ethical collisions.
The war on terror brought MI5 under unprecedented public and judicial scrutiny. It aggressively tested the legal boundaries between the necessity of national security and the fundamental preservation of human rights.
And this brings us to the controversies and legal battles that have defined the modern era of the agency. We're going to look at several specific legal rulings and investigations based purely on the facts of the cases as they were adjudicated.
A major point of modern legal friction involves bulk data retention. The passing of the Investigatory Powers Act in 2016 formally codified the use of bulk interception warrants. It allowed intelligence agencies to retain massive, bulk personal data sets, essentially sweeping up vast amounts of communications data.
In January 2023, this practice faced a severe legal reckoning. The Investigatory Powers Tribunal, which is a special judicial body that oversees intelligence agencies, issued a landmark ruling in a lawsuit brought by the civil liberties advocacy group, Liberty.
The tribunal explicitly ruled that MI5 had operated unlawfully regarding its retention of bulk data. They found that MI5 had illegally retained data within its internal systems from late 2014 all the way to April 2019.
The mechanics of the failure were systemic. The tribunal found that MI5 operated with a fundamentally flawed policy that routinely failed to delete intercepted material promptly once the legal warrants authorizing its collection had expired or been invalidated.
Furthermore, and perhaps more damaging to the agency's reputation, the tribunal found MI5 to be in direct breach of its legal duty of candor.
The duty of candor means you cannot lie to the court by omission. The tribunal stated that MI5 had actively concealed these severe data handling issues from both the Oversight Tribunal itself and from the Home Secretary during the legal proceedings.
Another deeply troubling legal exposure involves the perilous mechanics of informant handling. We can look at a highly publicized recent case, commonly referred to in court documents as Agent X.
In February 2025, the High Court issued a ruling stating that MI5 had supplied false evidence to 3 separate courts regarding its management of a specific informant.
The details of the Agent X case are grim. The informant in question was a violent individual recruited by MI5 specifically to infiltrate dangerous far-right neo-Nazi groups.
During his time working as an informant, he was accused of committing severe domestic abuse against his former partner.
When the case went to court, a senior MI5 deputy director provided a formal witness statement. This statement falsely asserted that the agency had an absolute lack of prior awareness regarding the informant's history of abusive and violent conduct.
The judicial pushback was fierce. In July 2025, a panel of 3 judges in the divisional court slammed MI5's conduct. They explicitly rejected the agency's explanations for the false statements as entirely inadequate.
The court's ruling noted a pattern of repeated deceptions across multiple legal proceedings designed to protect the informant.
As a result, the court ordered a robust, independent external inquiry to investigate the systemic failures within MI5's evidence handling and informant management protocols.
The agency has also faced severe legal challenges regarding its historical complicity in international renditions. A primary example is the Belhaj case.
Claimants filed a lawsuit alleging that both MI5 and MI6 were directly complicit in the 2004 extraordinary rendition of a Libyan political dissident.
The dissident and his pregnant wife were captured, handed over to Muammar Gaddafi's regime in Libya, and subjected to severe torture.
This prolonged litigation was ultimately settled by the UK government in 2018. The government issued an unreserved formal apology to the victims after recovered Libyan administrative documents provided undeniable evidence of British intelligence sharing that had directly facilitated the capture and rendition.
And if we look further back into the historical record, we must examine the interrogation practices used during the Troubles. Specifically, Operation Demetrius in Northern Ireland in 1971.
During this operation, 14 IRA suspects, who became known as the Hooded Men, were subjected to what were termed the 5 techniques.
The mechanics of the 5 techniques were brutal. They included placing hoods over the suspects' heads for extended periods, subjecting them to continuous white noise, severe sleep deprivation, withholding food and drink, and forcing them to stand in stress positions against a wall for hours.
Declassified government records eventually revealed that these specific techniques were formally authorized by the Edward Heath government on the 7th of August, 1971.
The legal classification of these acts has been debated for decades. The European Court of Human Rights ruled in 1978 that the application of the 5 techniques constituted inhuman and degrading treatment.
However, the court explicitly ruled at the time that the techniques fell short of the legal definition of torture. Decades later, efforts by human rights groups to have the court revise this historical classification to formally acknowledge it as torture were ultimately dismissed by the court in 2018.
When you look at cases like Agent X, it perfectly illustrates the intense, often irreconcilable tension between operational secrecy and democratic accountability. The mechanics of intelligence gathering require dirty hands. If MI5 needs to disrupt a violent neo-Nazi terror cell, they cannot send in an Oxford graduate in a suit.
No, they have to recruit a neo-Nazi to infiltrate the group.
But when they recruit high-risk, violent individuals and then attempt to shield them from the justice system to protect the intelligence flow, how can the courts possibly verify the truth when the agency controls all the classified evidence?
This raises an important question, right? It is the ultimate dilemma of oversight. To manage this, democracies build complex mechanisms. You have the Investigatory Powers Commissioner's Office, which is supposed to conduct rigorous, independent inspections on the agency's use of surveillance powers.
And you have the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament, which scrutinizes the agency's overarching policies, administration, and expenditure.
But as the Agent X ruling and the Liberty Bulk Data ruling clearly demonstrated, those oversight mechanisms are entirely reliant on the intelligence agency being inherently truthful and transparent in its disclosures to the overseers.
If the agency lies, the oversight fails.
Precisely. But what we are observing in the recent decade is a shift in judicial deference. The courts are increasingly willing to pierce the traditional veil of state immunity.
In the Belhaj settlement, the Liberty Data ruling, and the scathing Agent X judgments, the judiciary is actively forcing MI5 to reconcile its need for operational secrecy with a strict, verifiable adherence to human rights laws and its statutory duties of candor.
The legal frameworks are adapting. sending a clear message that national security cannot be used as a blanket shield to cover procedural misconduct or perjury.
And the sheer pressure on the agency is immense because MI5 must navigate these incredibly strict modern legal frameworks while simultaneously facing a massive, unprecedented resurgence of aggressive, state-sponsored hybrid warfare. The threat landscape has shifted once again.
Which brings us to the present day and the reality of contemporary state threats in the 2020s. The focus has undeniably swung back toward hostile foreign nations.
To understand the current scale, we can look at the annual threat update provided by Director General Ken McCallum on the 16th of October, 2025. The metrics he released are striking.
He reported a massive 35% rise in state threat investigations in just a single year. State-sponsored threats now rival and in many sectors surpass terrorism in terms of operational demand for the agency.
Let us break down the mechanics of where these threats are originating and how they operate. Regarding Russia, since the invasion of Ukraine, MI5 has focused heavily on countering brazen assassination plots and acts of physical sabotage.
The defining example of Russian intent remains the 4th of March, 2018 Novichok nerve agent attack in Salisbury.
That was an assassination attempt against former Russian military officer Sergei Skripal and his daughter. The attack was executed on British soil by operatives from the Russian GRU military intelligence, specifically Unit 29155, who traveled to the UK utilizing false identities and smuggled a military-grade chemical weapon in a counterfeit perfume bottle.
The reckless deployment of Novichok caused immense public terror, resulting in the death of a British citizen, Don Sturgis, who accidentally came into contact with the discarded agent.
And Director General McCallum's 2025 update explicitly noted that Russian military intelligence continues to actively plot kinetic sabotage operations against UK physical infrastructure.
Then there is the deeply complex threat posed by China. McCallum has consistently warned of Chinese state-directed espionage occurring on what he terms an epic scale.
This is not necessarily the traditional espionage of stealing physical documents. This involves the systematic digital and human theft targeting advanced British technology, quantum computing research, and proprietary intellectual property from universities and tech startups.
The mechanics of the Chinese operations are highly sophisticated. They often mask their intelligence gathering through seemingly legitimate academic or business partnerships, frequently linked back to the United Front Work Department and the Ministry of State Security.
To highlight the immediacy of this threat, McCallum noted in his October 2025 speech that MI5 had disrupted a specific, highly damaging Beijing-linked espionage plot just the week prior to his address.
We are also seeing highly aggressive, lethal actions directed by Iran. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Ministry of Intelligence are actively plotting kidnappings, bombings, and assassinations targeting Iranian dissidents living on UK soil.
The crucial mechanic here is that Iran frequently attempts to mask its state involvement by leveraging and hiring local, organized criminal proxies to conduct the actual physical surveillance and violence, attempting to keep their own hands ostensibly clean.
To counter this massive evolution in hybrid warfare, the British government had to initiate a major legislative response. They passed the National Security Act 2023.
This sweeping legislation finally modernized the antiquated 1911 espionage laws. The new act specifically criminalizes the modern tactics of foreign interference, digital sabotage, and the use of criminal proxies.
The necessity of the 2023 legislation was born out of stark evidentiary gaps. When the Salisbury nerve agent attack occurred, or when hostile states hire local thugs online to intimidate a journalist in London, the old 20th century laws, which required strict proof of traditional espionage or the physical theft of state secrets, were completely insufficient to prosecute the new reality.
The new act enables MI5 to act preemptively, allowing them to disrupt these state-sponsored activities by criminalizing the preparatory conduct and the fundamental intent to aid a hostile state long before the trigger is pulled or the server is breached.
It honestly feels like looking into a geopolitical time machine. MI5 has essentially had to pivot all the way back to its original 1909 mission.
They were founded to counter the aggression of hostile states, and over a century later, that is exactly what they are doing again. But the battleground is no longer just physical shipping ports filled with dreadnoughts. The front line is now cyber networks, university research labs, and proxy criminal gangs operating in the shadows.
The arc of this agency is truly incredible. It began with Vernon Kell and a single clerk manually cross-referencing physical hotel registries to track spies. Today, the agency has to issue complex guidance to members of parliament on how to counter highly sophisticated digital phishing campaigns, deepfakes, and proxy manipulation.
The tools and the battlegrounds have completely transformed, but the fundamental mission remains entirely unchanged. It is always about breaking the causal chain before the sabotage happens.
Whether they were using paper card indexes in 1914 to blind the German military, or using advanced algorithmic analysis in the 2020s to disrupt a state-sponsored cyber attack, the goal is proactive containment.
Exactly. The vast intelligence machinery has evolved beyond recognition, but the core requirement to preempt the threat, to operate in the gray area before a crime is technically committed, remains the defining and most controversial characteristic of the security service.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to mull over as we conclude this deep dive into a century of shadows. Consider the profound, almost paradoxical psychological duality required of an MI5 officer operating today.
On one hand, they are sworn public servants, tasked with protecting the safety of a highly transparent democratic society governed by the rule of law.
Yet, to successfully protect that open society, they must do so by absolute mastery of the dark arts of deception. They are required to operate entirely in the shadows.
They must run informants through deeply murky, dangerous, ethical gray areas. They must routinely navigate covert operations that inherently break the laws of hostile nations.
As we look back at that rigid blueprint of national defense we discussed at the start, we have to ask ourselves a difficult question. How does a modern democratic society continuously reconcile the absolute, undeniable necessity of a secret police force with the fundamental ideals of an open, accountable society?
Can the glaring light of democratic oversight ever truly capture what happens in the shadows? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.